Behind the grandeur of Persia's palace, beyond the golden gates and silken robes, there was a secret. Not a scandal, not a plot, but a woman with a burden and a choice. Her name was Esther, and her story is not just about royalty, it's about quiet courage behind closed doors. She wasn't born into nobility. She was a Jewish orphan, raised by her cousin Mordecai in exile. Her people lived under the rule of a foreign king, in a culture that didn't see them, in a world that didn't value them. Esther had no titles, no power, no voice, until one day a summons changed everything. Vashti, the former queen, had refused the king's command and was removed from her position. A royal search began for her replacement, but this was not a fairy tale. It wasn't a romantic invitation. It was a command. Young women from across the empire were taken to the palace, groomed for a year, and presented before King Xerxes one by one. Esther was among them. She could have resisted. She could have revealed her heritage, but Mordecai instructed her to keep her identity hidden, and so she went quietly, blending in, carrying her faith in silence. And yet, in that silence, God was moving. She found favor, not just with the king, but with everyone who met her. And when the time came, Xerxes chose her to wear the crown. Esther, the exile, became queen of Persia. But the real story didn't begin with her coronation. It began with a decree. A man named Haman, elevated by the king, was enraged that Mordecai refused to bow before him. His pride turned to hatred, and he devised a plan not just to punish Mordecai, but to exterminate all Jews in the empire. With the king's signet, the decree was sealed. Death was coming for Esther's people, and no one knew she was one of them, except Mordecai. He tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned in the city square. Esther, sheltered behind the palace walls, heard of his distress and sent messengers to find out why. Mordecai's reply was simple and haunting. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. It was a moment of reckoning. Esther had hidden her identity to survive, but now that very identity held the key to salvation. To speak was to risk death. The law forbade approaching the king uninvited, yet silence would ensure the destruction of her people. Courage doesn't always look like a battlefield. Sometimes it looks like a woman standing alone in a palace hallway, knowing that one step forward could cost her everything. Esther made her choice. Go, gather all the Jews in Susa. Fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days. I will fast too, and then I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. It was not a statement of despair, it was a declaration of resolve. She would not let fear write her story. And in that quiet, trembling courage, the course of history shifted. If you've ever felt hidden, overlooked, or afraid to speak, Esther's story is for you. If you've been placed in a space of influence and wondered why, this is your reminder. God often positions us in places not for comfort, but for purpose. And if this truth is stirring something in you, if Esther's courage speaks to your own hidden battle, we invite you to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Your engagement helps us bring more of these stories to those searching for God's hand in their own. 3 days passed, and on the third, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace, facing the throne room. Every step she took was layered with risk. The law was clear. If the king did not extend his golden scepter, she would be executed. But when Xerxes saw her, he was pleased. He extended the scepter. Grace. Esther approached and touched its tip. The king asked what she desired, promising even up to half the kingdom. But Esther didn't rush her request. She invited the king and Haman to a banquet, and then another. She waited, not out of hesitation, but strategy. She was wise, discerning the moment. She didn't confront the plot in anger or panic. She moved with patience, prayer, and precision. At the second banquet, the king again asked her what she desired. Esther finally spoke. "If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request." The king was stunned. Who is he? Where is the man who has dared to do such a thing? Esther turned to Haman. The adversary and enemy is this vile Haman. The room fell silent, and in that silence justice began to turn. The king rose in fury, left the room, and returned to find Haman pleading at Esther's feet. It was too late. The trap Haman had built for Mordecai became his own undoing. He was executed, and the decree, it could not be revoked. But the king issued another, one that allowed the Jews to defend themselves. Across the empire, what was meant for their destruction turned in a day of victory. But don't miss this, the victory wasn't born in a throne room. It was born in a prayer room, in fasting, in quiet surrender. Esther's power wasn't in her crown. It was in her courage to trust God in silence behind closed doors when the outcome was uncertain. And that's where many of us live, in the in-between, in the waiting and the tension between fear and faith. We may not stand before kings, but we stand in offices, schools, living rooms, carrying burdens no one sees, wrestling with decisions no one knows about. And still, God calls us to speak, to act, to believe that we have been placed where we are for such a time as this. Esther's name isn't mentioned in Hebrews 11, the famous Hall of Faith. But her legacy stands just as strong, because real faith doesn't always look like shouting on mountaintops. Sometimes it looks like trembling hands holding on to truth and still choosing to act. Esther's story teaches us that influence is not always loud and courage is not always visible. Some of the greatest acts of bravery happen in silence, in decisions made without applause, in sacrifices no one sees, and yet God sees. He saw Esther when she was just a girl in exile. He saw her in the palace behind closed doors. He saw her fasting, praying, choosing obedience over comfort. And he sees you too, wherever you are. You may not wear a crown, but you carry a calling. You may not stand in a palace, but you have a voice. And in the moments when it feels easier to stay silent, remember Esther. Remember that your voice may be the key to someone else's deliverance, that your obedience may open the door for a breakthrough you can't yet see. The world honors boldness in battle, but heaven honors faith behind the scenes. And the God who worked through Esther still works through you, through your yes, through your risk, through your hidden courage. So ask yourself, what door has God placed you behind? What space has he entrusted to you? And what might happen if you dare to speak? The fate of a nation turned because one woman chose purpose over fear. She chose to rise, to act, to believe. May we do the same for such a time as this. Sometimes we imagine courage as something loud, shouting truth in the streets, leading armies into battle, standing at podiums. But biblical courage often begins in stillness. It starts when no one is watching, when the decision is internal and the stakes are invisible to everyone but you. Esther's courage wasn't defined by dramatic speeches. It was formed in the quiet, in the 3 days of fasting, in the trembling steps toward the throne room. In every moment she chose obedience over escape. And isn't that where many of us find ourselves? Behind a door. Not a palace door, but a door of decision. the door of silence or speaking up, the door of staying or stepping out, the door of convenience or calling. You may be the only one in your workplace who carries light. You may be the only voice in your family willing to speak grace. You may be positioned in your community, your school, your home, not by accident, but by divine design. What if your moment is now? What if someone else's freedom is tied to your faith? Esther had no idea what her yes would unlock. She simply trusted. And because she did, generations were saved. We still speak her name, not because she was the loudest, but because she was faithful. Courage behind closed doors is still courage, and God still honors it. So wherever you are, however unseen you feel, however small your influence seems, don't discount the weight of your obedience. God writes stories with surrendered hearts, and yours might be the next chapter. Walk forward, fast, pray, speak, act, and trust that heaven is with you, even behind closed doors, because the God who raised Esther for her time has not forgotten you and yours. You were born with purpose. You were called into this moment. And when you feel the weight of fear press against your heart, remember her words, "If I perish, I perish." It was not a resignation. It was a release of control, of comfort, of self. And in that surrender, God moved. He always does. So say yes, not because it's easy, but because God is worth trusting, even behind closed doors.